Hey everyone, my name is Zach Canord, and you're tuning in to DevSecOps, the good, bad, and ugly. I have with me here today, Sal.
Hello.
Sal. So Sal and I actually met at DevOps Enterprise Summit.
Yes, that was great. It was great being able to speak at that conference and getting to meet lots of new folks, seeing what's going on in the industry.
Yep. So that conference, if anybody doesn't know about it, is led by Gene Kim, and it's one more kind of at an executive or leadership level. But definitely highly recommend that. Sal and I got to spend quite a few days together, going out to dinner and whatnot. And that was part of the reason why I wanted to bring you on to this podcast, Sal. I know that you built out a DevOps practice at a large energy company in the past. And so was hoping maybe just to kind of kick this thing off, if you could talk about what did it, where did you start when building out a DevOps practice, and how did that progress over time?
Right. So I started a CI/CD pipeline about 14 years ago.
Right.
And it was just at a business unit level. So our business unit was pretty efficient running at the time. It was a brand new IT shop, so we had some freedom to kind of stand up what we wanted.
Right.
So we started with, we already had SVN, and then we brought on Bitbucket for our source code management system.
Okay.
So our developers would check in the code into either one of those tools, and then we had a automation tool, Jenkins, like a Jenkins, right? To basically monitor the source code system for any new commits, and then automatically kick off a build. And then during the build process, we would run our unit testing and build an artifact to deploy, and that we would push that artifact to a repository like Nexus.
Right.
And then we would have Jenkins jobs to pull the artifact out of the repository and then deploy it to our runtime environments like dev, test, QA, prod.
Right.
And then basically the cycle will repeat itself every day, right?
Right. And so was that at the business unit when you started that, Sal, or
Right, that was at a business unit, and then the company went all in with Agile,
Okay.
as most companies
Right.
did a few years ago,
So you
right?
had executive buy-in at that level with the DevOps.
For Agile, right? They weren't really that versed on DevOps
Okay.
or CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment. So, but they were all in on Agile. But you can't do Agile without DevOps, right? You need that continuous, iterative development environment.
Right.
So they got me to basically build the enterprise version of our DevOps system. So we used a lot of same tools that we did at the business unit level because they worked really well. Then we added more scanning actually to it.
Okay.
So we did quality scanning and security scanning.
Yeah, that actually leads in right into my next question. So I was going to ask, I was going to say that I know you were responsible for putting in the security controls and practices in addition to just the CI/CD pipeline. Can you walk us through, what types of security controls you look to put in place there?
So we started with a quality scan, so like a sonar cube.
Right.
So we implemented that tool. Then we work with cybersecurity on the security DevSecOps tools, right? So we implemented a SaaS tool, static application security testing tool, like a Checkmarks or a Veracode or Fortify.
Right. Yep.
Which we use to scan the code that the developers were writing for any security vulnerabilities, best practices, OWASP top 10
Got it.
vulnerabilities. And then the last piece within the pipeline for security DevSecOps was our open source scanning tool. So this is a tool that scans open source libraries or components that developers are using within their applications. So this would be a tool like Nexus IQ, right? Or Black Duck, for example. So what they do is basically take a bill of materials, right? Inventory of your application, and basically lets us know if any of those components have a license vulnerability, because open source components have licenses attached to them, or a security vulnerability.
Okay. Yep. So Sal, I mean, since you were the one that brought in those tools, right, within the pipeline.
Right, because I have a very extensive development background, so I kind of knew where all the skeletons were, so to say.
Better or worse.
So,
yeah.
So really wanted to make sure that for the enterprise that we addressed those things, because this is when you're dealing with a utility industry and you're dealing with nuclear or the grid, right? This is very serious business. So you really need to be careful with, really be diligent, really, with your security.
Yeah. So you mentioned open source, you know, and just because I've heard your talk before, I mean, what would you say? What percentage of your application is open source? A typical application today?
So with modern software development, right, you're looking at probably 70%, 80% of your application is mostly composed of open source, right?
Right.
The rest of it is really custom code that really is just stitching together the functionality of the open source components at the end of the day. Is really what's going on
that can
these
also
days.
be, sorry, Sal, I can find that it's eye-opening, right, for a security person to find out that the majority of your code base isn't yours. How did that go with, you know, I guess informing the security team of really what the fact that applications are assembled, they're not necessarily written.
Right. So that was kind of an eye-opener, right? In speaking with, and part of the groups that we brought into the DevSecOps effort was sourcing for the licensing issues, right? And then and also, of course, cybersecurity for the security vulnerabilities.
Right.
But what they didn't realize was how much of an application is composed of open source. Right. And they also realized that there was no way to track what was being used inside the company without a tool like a Nexus IQ, right?
Right.
And when we started running those scans, it was quite an eye opener for them.
Right. Not for you though.
Well, I kind of knew about it.
Right. Yeah, but still validate what you validated your
rigor around open source usage. I mean, everyone was always kind of skittish about open source, but I mean, developers are going to use it. I mean, there's no getting around that.
Right.
So the question is, how can you best manage and secure the use of it, right?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, no, and I see the same thing, right? People will say, "Hey, we don't use open source," and then all of a sudden they scan and they're like, "Wait a minute, so I'm in the same percentile as everybody else, even though we have that rule."
Right. I was probably one of the first developer architects to bring in open source into the company.
Really? Yeah, no,
and at that time, that was many years ago. That was kind of
bleeding edge.
Leading edge and kind of frowned upon.
Right.
But it was the way things were going to go in the future. So.
Yep, absolutely. So moving on to the next question, Sal, in regards to culture transformation, and within a DevOps practice, right? So the top was pushing agile, but you knew that you had to build out automation with a DevOps process with how you guys did development and communicated within your organization. Can you walk through how did you get these various groups on board, whether that be the development teams or leadership?
Right. So we kind of split that up into two phases, right?
Right.
So the first phase was around educating, socializing, and calibration and monitoring. So we were educating the development community on the tools and what the scans meant and how we could mitigate that, how we could shift left with the IDE plugins that came with those tools so that they could write secure code, use secure components early on in the development process while they're writing the code, right? So that we spent some time lunch and learns, presentations on that, on educating the development community.
Right.
The second phase is harder. So the second phase is what I would call governance and enforcement.
Right.
So that's taking the sourcing folks and the cybersecurity folks and educating them on what, for example, open source threats are.
Right.
And it was interesting, like when I first started talking about open source, is their minds immediately went to what I would call freeware. Okay. Things like a Notepad++ or a PuTTY, things you download from the internet, let's say an exe, right, that you install on your laptop and run. And that was not what I was talking about. When I really had to define what open source was to them. And it's basically the components or libraries that are part of a custom built application. And once they got their head wrapped around that, then we did deep dives into the tools and how the tools can manage those vulnerabilities that it finds and wrap a process around their groups on how to get from A, I found something, to B, let's work with the development team, to C, let's mitigate this and either waive it or fix the application. So
right.
That took some time. That they had to get their heads wrapped around the concept and then build a process around it and potentially staff, right? Because because you're now supporting, you have, let's say, a dozen folks who have to support 100 developers or 200 or 500 developers, and you might need more staff. And that's kind of like an aha moment for those folks, like, yeah, we don't have enough staff, so we might need to hire some more folks.
Right. And automate some of those processes, right, as well.
And automate, but it does take some time for them to learn a process or build a process. But once they start to get into the groove of it, it gets better.
So it sounds like really your best practice, Sal, of just the DevOps right tooling, sounds like comes pretty easy, but just building a solid way to educate those stakeholders, and whether that's on the development or leaders or security or legal, on what that looks like is probably the most important thing that you would say.
Right. Right. The tooling is the easy part. Standing up the tools is easy. It takes a week, literally.
Right.
It's the governance and enforcement is what's really challenging will be challenging to organizations, because one of the things that that can really get you is how you manage around when you run open source. There's options. And one of the options they're talking about, you can either whitelist or blacklist things, right? So they're talking about creating a whitelist, and this is something I did years ago at a business unit level, where you whitelist all the components that are being allowed to use in a company.
Right. Very manual.
Right.
Yep.
But that may not scale well when you roll it out enterprise-wide. So that's something organizations need to really consider, think about closely, is scalability of your process.
Yep. I completely agree. That's great, Sal. Anything that, this is kind of unprompted in the questions that I told you I'd ask you, but anything that you would say in regards to that they could do to educate? Like, is it any forms of education that you would say were helpful? Or is it just, having those frequent meetings with people to make sure you're on the same page?
So educating and is constant. Yeah, I mean, you're always going to do that. You're going to have new developers. You're going to have new people coming in all the time. And the more they hear it, the more they understand, right? Even though I've done it, I've had those presentations numerous times, the same people still show up, and the same people
At the same
learn
point.
even more, and they start even get more understanding. I think the first time you hear it, it's kind of like goes right over your head.
Right. Yeah.
And then the second time it's starting to sink in, and like,
Yep.
okay, I get it now.
Yep.
So, but it's a constant. Education is always going to happen. You're always going to have it forever.
Yeah, that's great. Hey, Sal, really appreciate you taking the time to join me here, and look forward to getting out on the golf course with you at some point down there in Charlotte. Okay.
Absolutely. Let's do that.
All right. Thanks, Sal. See you.
Thanks.